Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our presentation of the Community Engagement Model. My name is Gretchen Ratliff, and I will be one of your co-facilitators today.
Muy bien, pues bienvenidos a todos, a todas. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy para asistir a nuestra presentación sobre modelo de participación comunitaria. Mi nombre es Gretchen Ratliff y yo voy a ser una de sus cofacilitadoras el día de hoy.
Hi, my name is Aldo Cheney, and I will be your co-facilitator for today.
Mi nombre es Aldo Cheney, yo voy a ser también otro de los cofacilitadores el día de hoy.
So first off, I want to acknowledge the terrible fires that are currently impacting so many Californians. Our hearts go out to all those facing hardships, and we understand that folks may not be able to join us tonight for many reasons. So we will be posting a recording of this meeting on our website, and we're more than happy to make ourselves available to discuss the model and answer any questions in the future if this is not a good time for you.
Primero que nada, quisiéramos reconocer la situación con respecto a los incendios que están padeciendo muchos californianos y definitivamente entendemos que hay una situación muy complicada para muchos de ellos que están enfrentando este tipo de dificultades y entendemos que haya personas que no nos pueden acompañar esta noche por muchas razones. Por eso queremos hacer de su conocimiento que vamos a publicar una grabación de esta reunión en nuestro sitio web y que con mucho gusto vamos a tratar de hacernos disponibles para poder platicar sobre el modelo y también contestar cualquier pregunta que pudiera haber en el futuro si es que este no es un buen momento para ustedes.
For tonight's presentation, we'll focus on CARB's recently released community engagement model, the process of developing the model, and next steps. Our intent is to inform and circle back with the public on everything that's happened since our January 2023 kickoff meeting. But before we begin, let's set up our language channels and interpretation.
El día de hoy entonces vamos a enfocarnos en el modelo comunitario de participación comunitaria que recientemente liberó CARB, este proceso también de desarrollar el modelo, así como los siguientes pasos, y nuestra intención es informar también con respecto al público, con respecto a todo lo que ha sucedido desde nuestra reunión de inicio en enero de 2023. Pero antes de eso vamos a alistar nuestros canales de interpretación.
Next slide, please.
Siguiente diapositiva.
So we have an interpreter tonight who will provide live simultaneous interpretation, Grisel Villafana, and I'll hand it over to Grisel to explain how to access the interpretation.
Esta noche vamos a tener un intérprete que va a estar brindando los servicios de interpretación simultánea. Su nombre es Grisel Villafaña y ahora me voy a permitir dar las instrucciones para poder accesar la interpretación. Primero las voy a dar en español, posteriormente las voy a dar en inglés y para poder hacer uso del servicio, por favor, vaya a la parte inferior de su pantalla en Zoom, en donde aparecen los controles. Ahí debe hacer clic en el icono de interpretación que aparece como un globo terráqueo y seleccionar español. Si está utilizando la aplicación móvil de celular o en tableta también, o a veces en algunas computadoras y no ve el icono, puede presionar los 3 puntos que dicen más, después interpretación y después el idioma. To use the Zoom interpretation feature, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen where the meeting controls are, then click interpretation icon, select English or Spanish, and if you're using the Zoom mobile app on a phone or tablet, you can also choose the ellipsis that says more, or even in some computers as well, then interpretation, and then you can choose your language. Gracias and thank you.
Thank you, Grisel. Does anyone have any questions?
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
Okay, if not, we will start the interpretation.
Bueno, pues vamos.
Sorry.
Next slide. Okay. The presentation is available in English and Spanish. To select the presentation you would like to view, select the English or Spanish presentation at the top of the screen. We have CARB staff members Antonio Amaro, Karina Aguilera, Jacqueline Bartz, and Jose Lopez, who will be doing their best to translate comments in the chat from Spanish to English and from English to Spanish. These will appear as quoted responses to the chat. Thank you in advance for understanding that this can be challenging and CARB may not be able to translate every comment, but will do their best. If you have any technical difficulties, you can let us know in the chat. Next slide. We ask that participants please mute and rename yourself with your first name, last name, pronouns, and affiliation as shown on the slide. To do this, you click on the 3 dots in the upper right corner of your Zoom picture or video. Please let us know in the chat if you need assistance. Next slide. A few quick Zoom notes and instructions, and then we'll get started. Today's meeting will be recorded and posted on CARB's website. Please mute your microphone. To do so, click on the microphone or phone icon on the lower left corner of your screen. Next slide. Click on the camera icon at the bottom left of your screen to toggle your video on and off. Next slide. To raise your hand to be added to the speaking queue in Zoom, click on Participants, then Raise Hand. If you're on the phone, dial *9. Next slide. To chat, click on the chat icon near the center bottom of your screen. Choose a private chat to send a message to a host. Private chats are archived. Next slide. So tonight we'll go over CARB's recently released community engagement model, discuss the process used to develop the model, some of the feedback and how it was addressed, and next steps. Next slide. Before we begin, I'd like to review the meeting principles that were collaboratively developed with community experts. Be respectful. Let's be kind to one another. Create a space where everyone feels comfortable sharing their opinions and experiences. Focus on the agenda. Please focus comments and feedback on the agenda topics today so that we can be sure to cover everything in the time we have together. Keep equity central. Let's be equitable in how we treat each other during the conversation and keep equity central in the content of our discussion today. Let's treat each other respectfully by letting people finish their sentences and using appropriate and respectful language. Respecting diversity of experiences, ideas, and views. Making space and taking space. We encourage you to voice your views, and we also ask that you're mindful of the time and space needed during our conversation for everyone to participate. CARB is centering equity in the community engagement model and would like the discussion today to also center equity. Assume good intent. Critique the point or idea someone might be making, not the person. Take feedback with grace, with the assumption that everyone here has well-meaning intent. All ideas and points of view have value. Welcome new ideas and ways of thinking. Allow people to agree to disagree. Be open to hearing other points of view while also expressing yours. We want to provide opportunities for you to participate, and we want to take advantage of the benefits of the chat function, but avoid the distraction that can happen when any of us is writing or reading the chat. So to address this, CARB staff will be assigned to compile and summarize what's being placed in the chat. Given we will be answering most questions in this format, please don't think we're ignoring your feedback in the chat. And we hope this will allow everyone to listen actively and engage in the discussion. We intend to intersperse pauses during the presentation for questions. So if you have a question or comment, please enter it in the chat at any time. CARB staff will summarize the chat and address verbal questions during the presentation pauses. Our commitment is to complete this meeting within an hour, and if we're not able to get to all the questions, staff will stay after the presentation to take additional comments. And I will now pass the mic to Aldo to start the presentation. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Gretchen. In the next few slides, we will discuss why the model was created and provide an overview of the model. Next slide, please. CARB created Community Engagement Model as an agency-wide guide for staff to use in their work with communities. CARB values the involvement and engagement of communities, but we acknowledge that our engagement efforts have not always been robust or consistent. Additionally, CARB staff has been requesting support and the tools needed to integrate equitable community engagement into their work. This model and upcoming training will help staff engage with communities, including diverse and hard-to-reach groups. Lastly, we hope that the model will ensure that CARB's impact increasingly lead to more equitable, especially racial equity outcomes for all Californians. Next slide. Generally, the model introduced staff to the principles of community outreach and engagement. It contextualizes some of California history to deepen staff understanding of why community engagement is essential to CARB's work, and it takes staff through detailed step-by-step practices to develop, implement, and evaluate a community engagement plan. We will now drop the link of the community engagement model in the chat. Next slide, please. Before staff start planning their community outreach and engagement, the model introductory sections explain what the model includes and how to use it. What is community outreach and engagement? Why is it so important to the work and the key principles? The introductions also include high-level history of environmental injustices in California. Next slide, please. The model then guides staff through designing a community engagement plan. This includes preparing to develop a plan by thinking through goals, resources, community and CARB needs, the audience, and various logistics like budget and timelines. It discusses setting up expectations on how engagement will impact the relevant CARB actions or activities, detailing commitments to transparency and accountability. Staff are then taken to the planning section, which helps them create a comprehensive plan on who, what, where, and when engagement should happen. This section also details designing outreach methods and it emphasizes appropriate equitable outreach, attending to community needs, language and disability access, and reducing as many participation barriers as possible. Next slide, please. The implementation section walks staff through taking their plan and bringing it to life. It covers topics like creating accessible event materials that are in plain language, providing translation and interpretation services, and creating a welcoming and inclusive spaces and managing events. This includes facilitation methods for staff to address any conflicts that may arise during events. It also includes guidance to conduct appropriate evaluation of engagement activities through gathering participant feedback for refinement for future engagement activities. Next slide, please. In the last two sections, the model guides staff in following up with communities and others who participated in any engagement efforts. This ranges from acknowledging and thanking people for their participation to following up on key actions and reporting back on outcomes. Evaluations take staff through the steps to understand the impact and the lessons learned from both individual events and overall engagement efforts. Next slide, please. In the next few slides, we will provide an overview on how the model was developed. Next slide. The process started with a draft model that built on the work from Sarah Rubin and Crystal Love Lazard. We then received recommendations from 19 community experts and the public. We revised the model to address those recommendations and reported back to community experts on October the 21st of 2024. Now that we are launching the model, the Office of Racial Equity will provide technical support for staff to use the model, and ORE will also develop trainings on the model. The model is a living document that is subject to changes in the future. However, staff will not make changes for at least 2 years. During this time, staff will use the model, collect feedback from those we engage with, and get a solid understanding of how the model works before they make any changes. Next slide, please. As I said, we work closely with 19 contracted community experts who came from multiple areas from across California, as you see in the map. The community expert reviewed the model and provided written and verbal recommendations based on their professional and leadership and lived experiences. They met with us in 4 virtual meetings to discuss their feedback on the model. We will drop the link in the chat to list the list of community experts. Next slide, please. We won't name them individually, but community experts are shown here, and they are on the next slides. CARB is very grateful for their time, effort, and insights. Next slide. We also held 9 public meetings, including an introductory meeting in January of 2023. We held 8 public dialogues on the draft model between November 2023 through January of 2024, with over 300 attendees. 4 of the meetings were in person, and they took place in Yuba City, Salinas, East Oakland, and Riverside. The other 4 meetings were virtual. So during today's meeting, we will report back on the entire model development process and the next steps. Next slide, please. We received around 2,800 comments from community experts and the public. Community experts provided input via line edits and responding to specific questions and prompts. They also provided verbal feedback during meetings. The feedback was also collected from the over 200 attendees during the public community dialogue sessions. The public also provided written comments through a public docket. Staff also received feedback from individual calls and emails with community members, advocates, and community-based organizations. There were also internal dialogue sessions with CARB staff. The internal comments were not included in the final comment count. Slide, please. In an effort to keep transparency and accountability central throughout this process, we tracked all comments along with the response to each comment in a publicly posted spreadsheet. We took the yes approach to comments, and we were able to incorporate over 80% of the comments into the model. We also posted a summary of comments on the community engagement webpage. Now, please drop the link in the chat of the public comment table. Next slide, please. Comments were either incorporated into the model or not included. Some of the comments that were not included in the model were instead added to the recommendations document. Comments in this category were outside the scope of the model or required additional decision-making from CARB's leadership. This included recommendations for additional staffing and funding. The recommendation document is posted to our website. Other comments that were not included in the model received an explanation for why it wasn't incorporated. We will discuss some examples later. Next slide, please. So we just covered the model and how it was developed, the role of community experts played in the model development, and how we collected feedback during 9 public dialogue sessions. Now, we would like to take a pause to take any verbal questions and to summarize any questions from the chat. If you'd like to raise your hand and get added to the queue in Zoom, just click on participants, then raise your hand. Or if you're on the phone, please dial *9. Okay, we have one question in the chat. How did CARB decide which community experts to invite? So the community expert process, it was a solicitation process that we did an outreach to the public, and through that process, that's how we came up with the 19 community experts. It was through a solicitation process that we received applications, and it was reviewed by CARB staff, and those 19 experts were chosen through that process. Were experts compensated for their time? Yes, they were contracted to meet deliverables and review the model, for example, submit comments. And yes, the community experts in this process, they were compensated for their time. Thank you for that question. Okay, thank you for those questions. We truly appreciate your input. Now I'm going to hand it over to Gretchen. She's going to start on comment themes.
Thanks, Aldo. So we can go to the next slide, please. So we'll go over the general themes of comments that we received on the model now. The comment summary is organized by these 6 themes, which we'll cover in detail over the next few slides. If you'd like to see more specifics on each, you can review the comment summary posted on the CARB website, and we'll also post that link in the chat right now. Next slide, please. First, we heard comments about staff skills, that the model should promote cultural competence, which requires understanding and respecting the cultural nuances and values of the community, foster a safe and respectful environment for all participants, and train staff to respond to high conflict situations and harassment during events. So in the model, we describe cultural competence and provide resources and examples for staff to develop and implement those skills. We added a section specifically defining harassment and discussing how to address it during public events, and included tools to understand the difference between high emotion or passion and harassment. Next, we heard comments around promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need diverse representation from the community and overburdened members, and to include diverse voices, perspectives, and experiences to foster a rich and inclusive community dialogue. We ensured that the model includes tools to guide staff on how to understand who will be impacted and how to reach those groups. It details things to consider when designing engagement approaches so everyone can participate and feel welcomed and valued. The model encourages staff to work with trusted organizations that have more experience and expertise working with specific priority populations or in specific locations. Next slide, please. Improving engagement. We heard the model should promote transparency and accountability, including being transparent about what was heard and what was done with it. That staff should be flexible and willing to change based on the community's needs, and that the model should promote continuous follow-up after every interaction with communities. What we did, the model encourages staff to develop an approach for tracking feedback. For example, in a public summary action table, which tracks all feedback received and clearly identifies which were incorporated, not incorporated, or fell outside the scope of the action. The model guides staff that follow-up includes informing the public about how their feedback was considered, how it influenced the CARB action, any next steps, and sharing progress through annual reports. If engagement efforts are not meeting community needs, staff are encouraged to alter their efforts. We will follow this concept to improve the model itself by revisiting in approximately 2 years to make updates in accordance with community and staff feedback and needs. Power sharing. We heard the model should prioritize equitable listening and accommodate cultural, language, and other differences to ensure fair and inclusive community engagement practices, and that CARB should uphold community self-determination as a core principle, emphasizing the importance of involving communities in shaping their own destinies. What we did, the model guides staff and notes trainings on meaningful communication, including active listening and creating multi-directional flow of information, not just from the top down. The model emphasizes equipping communities with the information, resources, and capacity building needed to make informed decisions. A core community engagement principle in the model emphasizes the importance of respecting communities' right to self-determination and ensuring participants are always treated with dignity and respect. Next slide. Evaluations. We heard that we need to conduct evaluation processes with clear metrics throughout all community engagement efforts. So we ensured that the model describes event-specific evaluation where participants assess how individual events went and evaluation of the engagement effort overall. The model guides staff to set up measurable goals, assessment approaches, and reporting mechanisms at the beginning of their engagement. Model accessibility. We heard that the model's too long and that the various template titles did not adequately describe each section's contents. Our response is that the model is intended to serve as a reference guide for CARB staff to use throughout their engagement process. It was revised to ease readability. For example, worksheets and large tables were moved into appendices, and it was reorganized with clearer titles. While the model remains long, its length aligns with the complexity, nuance, and level of detail that staff need to provide consistent and meaningful community engagement. Staff have the responsibility to digest large amounts of information and follow reference materials. Lastly, detailed training and a workbook will help staff through the model in manageable steps. Next slide. Now we summarize the recommendations that fell outside the scope of the model or require additional resources to implement. These have been shared with our executive team and are available to view online. We will drop the link to this in the chat right now. The 6 major themes that emerged are listed here. The first is that CARB should adjust decision-making. This includes ensuring communities can influence a process, that they're engaged early and often, and that they have access to decision makers. In the case of co-developing multi-directional dialogues with demonstrable action, we specifically heard that CARB should host regular community listening sessions with air districts to determine how best to meet community needs. That meeting agenda should be co-developed with communities, focusing on multi-directional conversations and dialogue, and that meeting should result in transparent and demonstrable actions. The next major theme we heard was to improve our engagement practices. This includes that we ensure adequate time for engagement, airtime equity, improve knowledge access, improve collaboration and coordination, increase qualified staff, and improve engagement through evaluation and action. In the case of knowledge access, we heard that we need to improve and streamline CARB accessibility for communities. For example, there are existing challenges in accessing information at CARB, in understanding who to ask for assistance, getting timely and accurate responses, and having a centralized place for information. The next major theme we heard was to increase transparency, especially through standardizing practices. Desired options include posting pre- and post-meeting materials online, documenting all comments and how they were addressed, and articulating how community engagement impacted CARB action. We also heard from several experts and the public extensively that we should strive to remove barriers to engagement. In terms of monetary barriers, this includes the idea that all public-facing CARB actions should have budgets to support community participation. General categories that require additional investment include service contracts, stipends, childcare, elder care, food, and transportation. Additionally, there should be standing budgets to compensate tribes and CBOs to partner on engagement activities like outreach, co-designing events, and co-hosting events. In terms of non-monetary barriers, requests primarily focused on consistent and accurate translation, interpretation, and Americans with Disabilities Act best practices for all external materials and meetings. Communities also requested improved messaging, plain language communications, and background information. Lastly, communities requested external facilitators focused and trained on community engagement and racial equity. Another major theme we heard was that CARB should create a tribal engagement model, and this recommendation is currently moving forward. The last major theme is that CARB should address harms and document equity efforts. We heard that we should acknowledge community perceptions of CARB harms. These can range from ongoing health impacts from air quality disparities to more acute events like mismanaging community events. Work on this recommendation is moving forward through our Office of Racial Equity, and we will soon publish a document that summarizes CARB's recent efforts to advance racial equity and update our equity webpage to share current and historical efforts. We will drop a link in the chat to a document called Community Expert and Public Comment Recommendations to strengthen relationships with communities within the CARB community engagement model. Next slide. Okay, so we just covered a lot. We covered the comment themes that feedback we received on the model fell into, how we incorporated those and other changes into the model. Additionally, we covered the recommendations that fell outside of the model scope or require additional resources to implement. So we'll take another pause for verbal questions and to summarize any comments that were input in the chat. Again, if you're on the phone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand. So it looks like in the chat we had a question, is the Cultural Competence Guide on CARB's website? Let's see. So the model does define the term and it points to internal trainings and details how to understand and address the community staff are working with, but there's not a separate guide at this point. Do we have any other questions, verbal or chat? Okay, so I will go ahead and pass the mic back to Aldo for the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I just saw a comment in the chat. How is CARB planning to lead other agencies in this work using this model? So this model is available to the public and it is available to other agencies to utilize. And I'm sure we'll be able to make any ancillary documents available to them as well. We are going to be developing training. And I see Lisa put in the chat, I strongly support creating a tribal engagement model. Thanks, Lisa, for that comment. We do too, and we're glad that that work is moving forward. In the chat, who will be the target of the training? The training is going to be for staff. The community engagement model was developed for staff to use as a tool in their interfacing with communities and to do that better. Will you be contracting training out too? The process for training is still under development. The training has not begun development yet. Okay, thank you everyone for your questions. And Aldo, I'll pass the mic over to you.
All right, thank you, Gretchen. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go into the next steps. Next slide, please. Now we move into talking about our next steps with the model. The model was developed by the Community Engagement Capacity Building Work Group made up of staff from across CARB. Now, the Office of Racial Equity will support staff going forward. ORE vision is to operationalize CARB's commitment to just social change by working with all levels within the organization and externally by addressing environmental injustices and advancing racial equity in the achievement of its mission. The model is one of the racial equity tools CARB staff will use to operationalize racial equity into policies, programs, and regulations. We will begin developing internal training for CARB staff. In the meantime, we are encouraging and supporting staff to use the model while trainings are being developed, and the Office of Racial Equity team will help guide staff as they prepare their engagement plans. In the terms of working towards long-term goals, we understand it would be a gradual process as staff learn how to use the model and then start to implement it in their own community engagement plans. The vision is for the model to set a foundation for improved community engagement practices across the agency and to strengthen our community partnerships. As staff implement the model based on their experiences and your experiences with us, we want to be in a space where we can constantly learn about how we can do better in our engagement and outreach efforts. We will incorporate updates into the model based on staff and community members' feedback in the future. Next slide, please. We are excited to have available on our website the revised model, the summary of major comment themes and changes made since the first draft of the model, a comment response table, and last, the recommendation to CARB leadership for comments outside the scope of the model. This information is available in Spanish and English on our website. Please see the link for the model support and resources in the chat. So drop the community engagement web page in the chat. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this concludes our presentation on the community engagement model. Please take the posted survey if you're interested in receiving updates on the model. Please include your name and email in the survey. We will drop the link to the survey in the chat as well. You can also email us any questions or comments at communityengagement@arb.ca.gov, which we will drop in the chat. Thanks to everyone for your contributions and support in developing the model and for participating in this meeting today. We deeply appreciate all of the time and energy you spent to help us improve our community engagement efforts at CARB. The amount of the input and insight was amazing, and we learned so much from all who participated through this process. Staff will stay on for a few more minutes. If there are any additional questions on the model, we are here for you and to answer your questions.
And I see that there were a couple comments in the chat. And there was one in strong support of connecting with communities early and often. And we thank you for that comment. We did hear that a lot during the process of the model development, and that is why that's reflected in the model.
We have one question. Will leadership staff be trained as well to ensure consistency and support for community engagement throughout CARB? Yes, everyone it will be trained on the model. We have a comment. Heather, please unmute.
Hi, everyone. Heather from Uplift San Bernardino at the Making Hope Happen Foundation. I want to thank you all for this experience. This has been quite an experience on the community expert side as well. And I have learned so much from the community experts in different locations. And then when reading the drafts as we went through, I learned so much about our histories in different areas and was able to implement some of the really great ideas into our organization. So I want to just thank you, CARB. Great job on doing all of this. This was a really interesting and cool experience for a data geek like me. And thank you, experts. especially for all of your input and all the work that you all do.
Thank you, Heather, for those comments. We really appreciated all the work and the effort and everything you guys put into this whole process. And we really couldn't have done it without all the experts. I'm seeing in the comments from Diane, will the model be used in any other geographical area besides the forementioned? So Diane, those were the locations of the in-person public dialogues that we held in an effort to gather more input on the prior version of the model. So the model will be implemented across CARB, not just in those cities. And then Lisa, I see your comment that you'll be working with a few different tribes that were awarded a CARB shared transportation grant. And we thank you for your willingness to collaborate with us. We appreciate you reaching out. And I hope I didn't miss anything. Anybody else, feel free to jump in if I'm missed a comment. Okay, Aldo, you want to close us out?
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending the meeting, and we appreciate the input that you gave today. It was very insightful, and once again, we truly appreciated the process and the engagement that we did on this community engagement model, and we look forward to operationalize the model into all CARB activities. So on that, I'd like to hand it over to Gretchen for closing out also. And once again, thank you for attending the meeting and participating in the process.
Thanks everyone for attending. Again, if you have any other comments or questions that you think of after this meeting, feel free to reach out, community engagement at arb.ca.gov. And I'll open it up to anyone else who wants to make a verbal comment. Okay, thank you everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you.
I think there was a comment real quick, sorry, in the
Uh-oh. They
chat.
just popped
Okay,
in.
yeah, I'm seeing a couple more come in now. What is the broad stroke name for the line of work you all do? Eliana, do you want to clarify? I'm not sure if I know what you are asking.
So Gretchen, I can maybe try to help a little bit. Oh yeah, I see the chat. Hi, Ileana. This is Radhika Majal. I'm the Chief of Environmental Justice and Equity Branch, and CARB is the regulatory agency responsible for providing clean air for Californians, and our focus is on the environment. But along with our mission of providing clean air, we also are committed to furthering racial equity and environmental justice within CARB. So our focus, you can say, is air quality. That's our main, our center stone, but we also work towards community engagement. We write regulations, so we have public processes for that. And we also have incentives. So there's a public process for providing incentives for that too. So everything rotates around our air quality. So if you say that's probably our bread and butter.
Thanks, Radhika, for jumping in on that one.
Of course.
Radhika, do you mind also, there was a question about additional listening sessions. I know that those are planned for in the future. Do you want to say maybe a little sneak peek about that?
Of course. So the one thing I know the question is about, hold on, let me put on my glasses, folks. 1 second. Thank you. So the question was about other listening sessions in different areas, right? So the community engagement model, we've pretty much developed with the model. We've done the sessions in the model. We do have a program that we have already piloted. We started off already, which is called the Conversation Series with the Executive Office. And in that, we have already invited folks over, the organizations, to have conversations with CARB's executive office team, so they can talk about and give information or just have a conversation. It's a very informal conversation, so which is pretty much like, it could be considered as a listening session for our executive team, for a leadership team. So that is one of the very important programs that we have right now, and we are planning to kick that off sometime in March timeframe, so February-March timeframe. So that is one program that we are definitely, we have that. The other opportunity currently is with our racial equity lens. So we are developing another equity tool, which is called as the racial equity lens. And in that tool, we are currently in the process of ground truthing that tool. And we have sent out, the solicitation is open for anyone who would be eligible for applying to be part of that community expert group. So as that process continues on, we will have a public session. I don't know if it will be a listening session at this point or not, but we are going to have maybe a public dialogue session about that tool as well. So that is one other tool that is part of my team, or the Office of Racial Equity, that will be leading that effort. So in terms of the model, I think the engagement on this model, the public engagement on this model is completed. As this is our last meeting here. The next step for us is to now finalize the model, make some revisions, and then release the model. And I see the smiles on the team's faces up here, because they have put in a lot of effort. So I can acknowledge why the smiles are there for the team, for sure. So that's our next step, would be to release the model for internal CARB staff, and update the model, post it publicly so that other agencies or other organizations can utilize the model. We also plan on updating the model at some point of time within the 2 years. So first of all, that seems very far-fetched for me right now, because right now we are involved with, let's get the model out, let's start implementing, and let's take the lessons learned, let's take what are the what best practices our staff is coming up and hear from the communities, and then release, then get into the process of the update, the the 2.0 version of the model. And of course, in that model, we may have some listening sessions or some public process for that, but haven't thought that far out yet.
And then I see that Ileana had one more question about what departments the specific work falls under. So the group of folks that you see here from CARB were from across all different divisions within CARB. So it was really an effort, an agency-wide effort to bring this model together. And all divisions across CARB will be able to have the training and implement the model in their work. And the Office of Racial Equity is kind of a department or an office within CARB, and they're going to be leading up, taking over the model and developing the training and providing staff support going forward. Thank you for your questions, Ileana. Appreciate it. Moses?
Thank you, team. Appreciate everyone's time and efforts put into this team. Congratulations. A lot of hard work went into this, and I appreciate everyone's work on this. I just want to give you a big kudos on page 98 of your plan already now. Managing discussion, you've already hit those points there of actually informing us in the community and engaging and actually informing us. So I want to give you that recognition in this moment. I definitely, that caught my eye, so I will be using that as well. So I appreciate this work as here working in the community, but also working with you as well. So look forward to a very successful implementation and all of us taking advantage of this hard work. So thank you again.
Thanks so much for your comments, Moses. Much appreciated.
Gretchen, if I may add something, I know the talk about the listening sessions. We will have my team can put in the link for the Racial Equity Lens expert group solicitation in the chat. If someone in this public meeting is interested in that, we'll just put it in the chat in a minute or so.
Great, thank you. Okay, I see that link got dropped in the chat. And we're available for any further questions or comments. Feel free to drop off if it's past time. Feel free to unmute and raise your hand, drop a question in the chat. We appreciate all the comments.
Have a good night. Be safe. Thanks all.
Thanks everybody for coming out.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.